Welcome back, chosen ones. There's a particular kind of silence that falls when someone realizes they spoke too soon. Not the awkward kind, the dangerous kind. The kind where words echo back months later wearing the weight of truth they weren't supposed to survive. The most unsettling part of being watched was never the attention. It was the moment the watchers realized their commentary aged badly. They thought they were early. They thought they were sharp. They thought they had you figured out before the story even started, and now they're sitting with the discomfort of outcomes that refuse to match their predictions. Somewhere along the way, observation turned into premature judgment. They didn't just watch you, they narrated you, labeled you, spoke on your trajectory like it was already finished. They mistook a pause for a plateau, a recalibration for collapse, a quiet phase for irrelevance, and they said it out loud, confidently, publicly, as if certainty itself could bend reality into agreement. But certainty without understanding has a short shelf life. And now, time is collecting receipts. They tracked your movements like they were documenting a failure in slow motion. They replayed moments out of context, isolated decisions, exaggerated pauses, and stitched together a narrative that made them feel smart for arriving early to a conclusion. They didn't realize they were mapping shadows, not structure. They assumed your silence meant confusion, that restraint meant hesitation, that your refusal to explain meant you had nothing to stand on. They spoke too soon because they thought behavior always follows the same emotional sequence. Stimulus, reaction, decline, predictable, containable, finished. What they missed is the moment everything shifted internally. The point where reaction stopped being the engine and principle took the wheel. That's where prediction fails. When someone stops leaking their process and starts moving from alignment, timelines become useless. Patterns collapse. Commentary ages fast. You didn't announce the shift. You didn't correct anyone. You didn't rush to defend your name or clarify your intentions. You let them talk. You let them be loud in a future that hadn't arrived yet. That's when curiosity quietly turned into fixation. Because the story they told about you stopped matching the evidence. What they framed as decline didn't materialize. What they mocked as stagnation started producing results they couldn't explain. Their early confidence began to rot under the pressure of outcomes they didn't anticipate. And instead of adjusting their framework, they doubled down on watching, taking mental notes, replaying conversations, revisiting old assumptions, trying to figure out where the timeline broke. You weren't hiding. You weren't plotting in secret. You were doing something far more destabilizing. You were upgrading without spectacle, integrating lessons instead of advertising growth, refining decisions instead of chasing validation. While they were busy narrating your ending, you were quietly changing the rules of the story. That's why nothing lined up anymore. The behaviors they expected never repeated. The reactions they predicted never arrived. The version of you they spoke about stopped existing before their words even finished circulating. There's a strange irony in being analyzed by people who don't realize their analysis expired. They zoom in on old footage while you're operating in a different frame rate entirely. They compare screenshots while you're adjusting the system behind the screen. They whisper theories about motives you outgrew months ago, and the more reality contradicts what they said, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Because now it's not just about you, it's about the fact that they spoke with certainty on something they never understood. This was never about secrecy. It was about timing and sovereignty. You didn't conceal your direction. You refused to rush it to satisfy outside commentary. You didn't break their model. You evolved beyond it. And now they're left staring at outcomes that don't align with their words, trying to reconcile confidence with contradiction. That's where the tension lives. Not in your actions, but in their premature conclusions. They expected repetition. They expected regression. They expected you to circle back to something familiar so their early statements could feel justified. But you moved forward without checking who was watching. You let growth happen off camera, and now every new development feels like a quiet correction they never asked for but can't ignore. The panic doesn't come from what you're doing. It comes from what their words can no longer explain. Observation becomes uncomfortable when it turns inward. When they realize the story they told says more about their framework than your reality. When frustration replaces confidence, when obsession replaces understanding, when the silence after speaking too soon grows louder than any commentary that came before it, the truth lands slowly, then all at once. The problem was never your pace, your quiet, or your restraint. The problem was that they mistook early judgment for insight, and now it's all coming true. Not the version they predicted, but the one they never accounted for, the one that doesn't announce itself, the one that doesn't ask for permission, the one that makes premature commentary look foolish simply by existing. You didn't need to correct them. Time did it for you. If this message hits something deep, don't let it pass in silence. Support this work by liking the video and subscribing to the channel so this energy keeps reaching the minds that need it most. Share your support through super thanks if you're able, because every contribution directly fuels the effort, time and focus behind creating these inspiring, life-changing, high-energy messages. This isn't just content, it's a transmission meant to sharpen awareness and strengthen alignment. Your support keeps the team pushing forward, raising the standard and delivering messages that cut through noise and spark real internal shifts. Number 1. Why everything stopped working the moment you changed how you evolve. You didn't just break the pattern, you changed the game. They weren't wrong about watching you. They were wrong about what watching could do. This is the moment everything stopped working for them, and it happened quietly, without drama, without an announcement, without permission. The second you changed how you evolve, their entire system collapsed. Not because you became unpredictable in a chaotic way, but because you stopped evolving for continuity and started evolving for truth. They were waiting for you to loop, to return, to soften back into something familiar. Most people do. Most people recycle the same reactions, protect the same wounds, and respond to pressure using muscle memory instead of awareness. That's how patterns become reliable. That's how people become easy to manage. But you never moved like that, and that's where the problem started. You didn't improve in a straight line. You didn't upgrade in a way that made sense to outside observers. One season, you were visible, expressive, present. The next, you pulled back, recalibrated, disappeared from reach. To them, that looked like inconsistency. To you, it was precision. You weren't reacting to moods, opinions, or pressure. You were responding to internal data, to what you learned, to what you outgrew, to what no longer deserved access. And that single shift shattered their expectations. They expected growth to look neat, progressive, easy to chart. They assumed evolution meant becoming a cleaner version of who you already were. But real growth doesn't behave that way. Real growth contradicts old habits. It abandons outdated strategies. It refuses to honor history just because it exists. That's why they reached for labels instead of understanding. Unstable, confused, unpredictable. Words people use when their framework can't keep up. It's easier to question your coherence than to admit their lens is too shallow. Here's what never changed, no matter how much your expression did. Your core, your standards, your direction, your internal compass never wavered. What changed was your tolerance, your access points, your willingness to repeat behaviors that no longer matched who you were becoming. You didn't erase your past, you integrated it, you took the lessons, applied them, and moved forward without dragging old versions of yourself along for reassurance. That's why their notes stopped lining up. The version of you they studied last month doesn't respond today. The button they pressed 100 times doesn't work anymore. The situation that once slowed you down barely registers now. They call that inconsistency because they don't understand integration. You're not contradicting yourself for attention. You're updating yourself for survival and alignment. This is the power of being chosen, whether they like the word or not. Not chosen by some external force, but chosen by clarity, chosen by awareness, chosen by the refusal to live on autopilot. People who rely on repetition to feel powerful panic when they encounter someone who evolves without warning, someone who doesn't need closure with their past to outgrow it, someone who doesn't need permission to change direction. They keep waiting for you to revert, to slip back into something recognizable, to confirm the story they told about you early on, but you don't. You shed versions of yourself the moment they stop fitting, and every time you do, it becomes clearer what this was really about. They weren't watching to understand you. They were watching to control you, to predict you, to time you. That strategy only works on people who mistake familiarity for loyalty. You chose evolution over consistency, and in doing so, you removed yourself from their reach, not by fighting them, not by proving anything, but by becoming someone their old rules no longer apply to. And that's why nothing they try lands anymore, not because you're hiding, because you've moved. Number 2, the kind of calm that makes pressure lose its grip. The calm you carry now is the kind that makes pressure question its own authority. This isn't stillness you rehearsed, or peace you stitched together to survive difficult moments. This is composure that formed after you stopped letting chaos set the agenda. People who don't understand this assume you're suppressing something, clenching your jaw behind a controlled expression, one breath away from unraveling. They're wrong. What you have isn't restraint, it's command. You didn't learn how to quiet emotions. You learned how to place them in their proper position. There was a moment when urgency lost its power over you. Not because life became easier, but because you stopped treating every stimulus like a summons. Tension can show up now without seizing the controls. Discomfort can exist without dictating your behavior. Where others get dragged into reaction loops, you pause, assess, and choose. That pause terrifies people who rely on emotional spikes to feel influential. They're used to pressing buttons and watching predictable results, raised voices, defensive explanations, rushed justifications. That feedback tells them they're still in control. With you, the signal never arrives. They push harder when the usual methods fail. Subtle jabs become louder provocations. Curiosity turns sharp. Accusations get dressed up as concern. They're fishing for movement, any movement, something that proves you're still tethered to the same triggers. But you don't take the bait. You don't accelerate when they rush you. You don't escalate when they lose composure. You don't scramble to protect an image that no longer needs defending. Not because you're detached from reality, but because your inner foundation doesn't wobble under external pressure. What unsettles them most is your stability when conditions get chaotic. When conversations heat up, you don't mirror the intensity. When narratives get messy, you don't rush to clean them up. You're not stuck, you're grounded. You've already confronted who you are, what you stand for, and where you're headed. There's nothing fragile left for them to exploit. Noise doesn't shake you because your sense of self isn't built on approval or agreement. Uncertainty doesn't rattle you either. You don't demand instant clarity to feel secure. You can sit with unanswered questions without spiraling into worst-case scenarios. That ability is rare because most people need control over outcomes to feel safe. You trust something deeper. Not blind optimism, but confidence in your capacity to respond when the moment actually requires it. That confidence isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself, but it's unmistakable. They mistake your restraint for disinterest. They think you stopped caring. In reality, you became precise. You learned that attention is a resource, not an obligation. You invest it intentionally. You don't pour emotion into every situation that asks for it. You don't engage in every conflict that presents itself. You don't react just to make others comfortable. And that's why they keep studying you, trying to decode how pressure keeps slipping off without leaving a mark. The truth they avoid is simple. You're not composed because you're dodging adversity. You're composed because you've built an internal structure that doesn't collapse when tested. Once someone reaches that level of self-governance, external forces lose their grip. Pressure can knock, but it no longer gets to enter uninvited. Number 3. What you see in provocation that others completely miss. They mistake your restraint for hesitation because they don't understand what they're looking at. In their world, speed equals power. Immediate response equals confidence. Noise equals dominance. So when you don't lunge at provocation, when you don't bite the hook they throw, they assume you didn't notice it or didn't know what to do with it. That assumption is where they lose. You're not late to the moment. You're ahead of it. While they're focused on triggering a reaction, you're reading the design behind the trigger itself. You're watching how the move was set up, what outcome it's trying to force, and who benefits if you respond the way they want. Silence for you isn't absence. It's positioning. What they throw at you isn't conflict, it's choreography. And you can see the strings. You recognize when a comment isn't meant to communicate, but to destabilize. When a challenge isn't about truth, but about control. When urgency is manufactured to rush you into a mistake. Others see the spark and flinch. You see the wiring behind it. That's why you don't react emotionally. You're not frozen. You're calculating relevance. You're deciding whether the moment deserves energy or deserves to be starved of it. Most people confuse attention with power. You've learned that withdrawal is often the sharper weapon. They celebrate prematurely when you don't respond the way they expected. They think they've won something. That illusion keeps them comfortable while you're adjusting the entire field. Their strategies rely on visible disruption. On emotional spikes they can track and exploit. But when your internal state doesn't fluctuate on command, their measurements fail. They're trying to chart a storm that never forms. And without turbulence, they don't know where to steer. This level of awareness didn't come from theory. It came from pattern recognition, earned the hard way. You've watched how people escalate when ignored, how they overexpose intent when their leverage doesn't land, how impatience reveals more than words ever could. You've learned that not every battle is a test of courage. Some are tests of discernment. Knowing when to act is important. Knowing when not to act is mastery. What unsettles them most is the accuracy of your responses when you do move. There's no excess, no explanation, no wasted motion. When you finally engage, it's clean and undeniable. They were preparing for chaos and met precision instead. That's why they feel like the ground shifted without warning. It didn't shift. You did. Quietly, deliberately, on your own terms. And by the time they understand what you saw from the beginning, they're already reacting to a game you finished playing 3 moves ago. Number 4, the behavior shift they misread, and why that mistake costs them. They're convinced they caught you in a mistake. A tonal shift here, distance there, a version of you that doesn't match the one they felt comfortable labeling. In their minds, consistency means repetition. Same energy everywhere, same openness with everyone, same access, same reactions, same availability. So when you don't deliver that, they assume something went wrong. A weakness surfaced, a crack showed, a moment of instability finally revealed itself. That assumption is the mistake that keeps costing them. Nothing broke, nothing leaked, nothing was exposed. You recalibrated. You understand something that escapes people who need predictability to feel in control. Behavior isn't meant to be uniform, it's meant to be responsive. You don't move through every space with the same posture because not every space carries the same intent. You don't offer depth to rooms that only know how to misuse it. You don't hand over access just because someone expects familiarity. That's not inconsistency, that's awareness. And awareness is expensive for people who rely on sameness to track you. Different environments demand different versions of presence. What works in one setting becomes liability in another. Silence can be power in one room, and conversation can be power in another. Distance can be protection. Warmth can be strategic. You know when to lean forward and when to pull back, not because you're trying to manage perception, but because you're protecting alignment. You don't adapt to be liked. You adapt to stay intact. That distinction is invisible to people who only know how to perform. What never shifts is your center. Your standards don't dilute. Your internal rules don't bend. Your sense of direction doesn't wobble. What changes is how much of yourself you allow into any given interaction. Some people get access, others get limits, some get dialogue, others get quiet. That's not emotional chaos. That's discernment sharpened by experience, and it's deeply unsettling to anyone trying to reverse engineer you. What frustrates them most is that you don't explain the shift, you don't issue statements, you don't soften the transition with reassurance. You don't walk people through your reasoning so they can stay comfortable. You trust your internal signal more than their interpretation. Your behavior communicates enough, and you're not interested in translating it for people committed to misunderstanding you. They try to isolate a real version of you, assuming everything else must be fake. That's their error. Every version is authentic. Each one is simply contextually precise. You're not scattered, you're integrated. You move fluidly because you know exactly who you are. That's why their analysis collapses. They keep searching for emotional leaks that don't exist. What they're witnessing is restraint paired with self-respect. You don't show everything everywhere because that would be reckless. You show what fits, when it fits, and only what's necessary. And the longer you do this, the more obvious it becomes. What they label as inconsistency is actually control at a level they don't understand. This isn't confusion, it's mastery. Number 5, how doing nothing turns you into an uncomfortable mirror. You don't unsettle people by acting, you unsettle them by not reacting. That's the part they never prepared for. Most interactions run on automatic reflection. Someone gives warmth, it's returned. Someone brings tension, it's matched. It's how people maintain control, familiarity, and comfort without thinking too hard. You stepped outside of that reflex. You stopped feeding the loop. And the moment you did, the dynamic flipped. Silence replaced validation. Presence replaced performance. And suddenly, everyone else became loud. When you walk into a space and don't adjust yourself to manage other people's comfort, something strange happens. They start managing themselves. They fill gaps you didn't create. They explain things you never asked about. They justify choices you never questioned, not because you pressured them, but because your stillness removed their reference point. Without your reactions to lean on, they're forced to face their own behavior in real time. That's why it feels tense. Not because you're intimidating, but because you're not cooperating with the script. You don't echo their energy, and that absence becomes revealing. The jokes get sharper, the confidence gets louder, the stories get longer. People expose what they're trying to hide the moment no one reassures them. They expected feedback and got neutrality. They wanted confirmation and received nothing. And in that vacuum, their patterns surfaced on their own. You didn't call anything out. You didn't correct or confront. You just stayed grounded, and that was enough to shift the balance. This is where they get uncomfortable, because now the spotlight isn't on you, it's on them. Every insecurity they thought was concealed starts leaking through over-explanation. Every inconsistency becomes visible without you pointing to it. They thought power came from controlling the interaction, but control only works when the other person plays along. You didn't, and that's why their composure slipped while yours didn't move an inch. What makes this harder for them is that your impact isn't aggressive. You're not asserting dominance. You're not posturing. You're not trying to expose anything. You're simply operating without distortion, clear, centered, unavailable for emotional management. That clarity functions like a clean surface. Whatever someone brings into the space shows up exactly as it is. No filters, no cushioning, no adjustment. They scramble because they think they're being tested. They assume there's a hidden agenda, but there isn't. You're not setting traps. You're not collecting leverage. You're just no longer bending yourself to regulate other people's internal chaos. And the longer that goes on, the more obvious it becomes. They aren't studying you anymore. They're reacting to themselves. You don't need to perform restraint or project mystery. By doing nothing, by refusing to mirror, you turn into something far more unsettling than a threat. You become a reference point they can't manipulate, a presence that reflects reality without comment. And once that happens, everything they wanted to keep hidden steps forward on its own. That's not influence you chase. That's influence that happens when you stop trying at all. Before we move forward, take a moment to support this work if it resonates with you. If this message reflects your experience, hit the like button so it reaches others who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected with content designed to sharpen your mindset, strengthen your clarity, and fuel your evolution. If you want to go a step further, consider supporting the team through Super Thanks. Your contribution directly helps us continue producing focused, high-energy, life-changing videos without compromise. Sharing this video also matters more than you think. Your support keeps this momentum alive and allows these messages to reach people who are ready to level up. Number 6. The one adjustment that makes watching you useless. They thought attention alone would eventually crack you, that if they stared long enough, something automatic would surface, a twitch, a spike, a predictable emotional surge they could catalog and reuse. That's how they've always understood people. Pressure in, reaction out, cause, effect, control. It works on those who move on reflex, who let stress dictate tone and discomfort decide timing. It doesn't work on you. The moment you made one internal adjustment, the entire process they relied on became useless. You stopped letting emotions set the schedule. Not because you became cold, detached, or disconnected, but because you learned how to separate intensity from direction. You can feel something strongly without handing it the steering wheel. That's the part they never anticipated. They expect urgency to create movement. They expect provocation to trigger response. They expect discomfort to force mistakes. But you don't move when they push. You move when it aligns. That single distinction ruins every method they use to measure behavior. They wait for the familiar signs: raised voice, defensive posture, over-explaining, silence that signals fear instead of control. But those signals never arrive. You don't escalate when cornered. You don't implode when watched. You don't perform emotion to reassure anyone that their pressure worked. What shows up instead is something far more unsettling: precision, timing, restraint that isn't forced but chosen. Your composure isn't a mask you put on. It's the result of having no need to prove anything in the moment. This isn't a trick you picked up recently. It's built into how you operate now. You trained yourself to distinguish between what deserves a response and what's designed to steal one. That training stripped emotional manipulation of its leverage. They can't bait you with urgency because you don't confuse speed with importance. They can't destabilize you with chaos because your center doesn't live in the noise. You experience pressure without letting it rewrite your behavior. That's why they keep watching. They're waiting for the crack that never comes, replaying conversations, analyzing pauses, looking for evidence that you're human in the way they expect humans to be. Reactive, predictable, governed by stress. But what they're seeing instead is someone who doesn't leak information through emotion, someone whose inner state isn't available for extraction. You're not hiding anything. There's no secret technique, no false calm. The reason they can't read you is simpler and more uncomfortable than that. You don't answer to external triggers anymore. You answer to your own internal standard. That makes you impossible to steer, impossible to corner, and impossible to weaponize. And once that reality sets in, watching you stops being useful. It becomes exhausting. Because observation without access doesn't create control. It only reveals how little they have. Number 7, the silent move that removes their influence without confrontation. They came into this assuming power was a contest, that if they raised their voice, sharpened their tactics, or applied enough pressure, you'd eventually meet them on the battlefield they prepared. They expected friction, resistance, a visible struggle. That assumption alone exposed their blind spot. Because while they were gearing up for confrontation, you were quietly removing the very conditions that make confrontation possible. You never showed up to wrestle for dominance. You didn't try to win. You made the entire exchange irrelevant. They pushed, expecting pushback. You didn't give it. They withheld, assuming hunger would pull you closer. It didn't. They created distance to regain control, then rushed back in to test attachment. Nothing moved. That's when confusion set in, because leverage only exists when there's something to grab onto, a need, a dependency, a craving for approval, clarity, validation, or reaction. The moment those needs disappear, influence evaporates. And you learned that lesson before they realized you were playing a different game. You didn't remove their power with force. You removed it by becoming unreachable to their methods. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had already decided what to believe. You stopped justifying boundaries to those who benefited from you having none. You stopped performing clarity for audiences committed to distortion. One by one, the handles they used to pull you into cycles of reaction disappeared. Not dramatically, quietly, cleanly. Then came the deeper shift. Expectation left the room. You stopped assuming fairness from those who repeatedly proved otherwise. You stopped hoping for mutual respect where it had never been offered. And without expectation, disappointment lost its leverage. Manipulation requires anticipation. When there's nothing you're waiting on, nothing promised, nothing imagined, there's nothing to exploit. That's when their tactics began to look desperate. Compliments flipped into criticism, coldness turned into sudden interest, silence became noise. None of it landed because every move they made was built on the belief that you were emotionally invested in the outcome. You weren't. What unsettled them most wasn't resistance, it was absence. You didn't declare independence, you didn't announce a withdrawal, you simply changed your availability. Access narrowed, energy redirected, presence became selective, and suddenly they were reaching for influence that no longer existed, replaying old strategies against someone who had already moved on. There was no door slam, no final word. Just a closed loop they couldn't reopen. This isn't emotional shutdown, it's precision. You still care, but without entanglement. You engage without surrendering your center. You move without asking permission. Control was never the objective for you because control requires constant force. You chose autonomy instead. By removing the need to win, to be seen, or to be validated, you made power games collapse under their own weight. You didn't defeat them, you stepped beyond their reach. And that's the part they'll never recover from. Number 8, the internal rule you follow that breaks every external strategy. There's a rule you follow that never appears in their playbooks, and that's exactly why every strategy they deploy collapses on contact. Most people move in response to whatever hits them last. Pressure triggers panic. Praise inflates ego. Fear shrinks vision. Comfort dulls discipline. That's the rhythm they understand, the cycle they rely on to predict behavior. It's how people get nudged, steered, and quietly managed. But you don't move to the rhythm of the moment. You move according to something far less negotiable. An internal law that doesn't flinch just because circumstances change. They can't replicate that because it isn't learned through tactics. It isn't situational. It doesn't bend when the environment gets loud. While others are pulled back and forth by whatever stimulus shows up, you filter everything through a fixed inner standard. You don't ask, what's easiest right now? You ask, what's correct for who I am becoming? That single difference breaks every external plan designed to influence you. They try pressure, expecting urgency to make you fold. They offer reward, assuming desire will soften your stance. They provoke, hoping emotion will rush you into a mistake. None of it works, because none of it reaches the place where your decisions are made. You don't make choices to satisfy the moment or appease an audience. You make them to stay aligned with yourself. That's why you can walk away from opportunities that look good on the surface, but feel wrong underneath. That's why you can face discomfort without scrambling for relief. You're not chasing outcomes. You're protecting coherence, and that creates a kind of consistency that can't be exploited because it doesn't depend on external approval or reaction. This is where their anxiety spikes. They're used to dealing with people who can be negotiated with, pressured, or tempted. People whose values shift when the stakes rise. But you don't operate inside that transactional space. You don't trade alignment for advantage. You don't exchange clarity for comfort. You don't surrender your center just because the moment demands speed. That makes you extremely difficult to move and impossible to rush. They may mislabel this as rigidity. They may call it arrogance, detachment, or emotional coldness. What they're really seeing is accuracy. You're not resisting the world. You're refusing to be ruled by it. Every boundary you set is deliberate. Every action you take is measured. There's no wasted motion, no impulsive detours. And that precision disarms them. They keep trying to forecast your next move using tools built to track reactions. But reactions aren't what drive you. Principles do. And principles don't spike, fade, or fluctuate on command. That's why their data leads nowhere. You aren't a variable in their system. You're a reference point they can't manipulate, a standard they can't duplicate, and a presence that forces every external strategy to fail simply by staying true to itself. Number 9. The transformation you never announce, but everyone reacts to. You never give them the moment they're waiting for, and that's what rattles them the most. They're conditioned to expect signals before a shift happens. A speech, a post, a dramatic withdrawal, some visible marker that lets them say, there it is, that's when it changed. They rely on announcements because announcements give them something to track, something to timestamp, something to control. But you don't move that way. You don't telegraph transitions. You don't preview your next chapter. You don't soften people into the reality that you're no longer the same. You let the change arrive fully formed, without warning, and let everyone else deal with the aftershock. What they don't understand is that your transformation never starts on the outside. It begins internally, long before anyone notices a difference in your behavior. Your priorities shift. Your tolerance recalibrates. Your attention becomes selective. Your standards sharpen. None of that needs an audience. By the time the external world feels the shift, the internal decision has already been finalized. There's no overlap period, no explanation window. The version of you they were comfortable with has already expired. That's why they feel like they missed something. Conversations feel different. Access feels restricted. Your responses carry weight without volume. You're not louder, but you're firmer. not colder, but clearer. People sense that something fundamental has changed, yet they can't point to a single moment where it happened. That uncertainty eats at them. They replay old interactions, searching for clues, trying to locate the exact second where control slipped out of their hands. They don't realize there was never going to be a visible exit. You didn't leave the room. You redefined the room. They expect growth to ask for permission, to negotiate, to explain itself so it can be understood and approved. Your evolution doesn't do that. It doesn't bargain with expectations or slow itself down to make others comfortable. It doesn't require validation to be real. You don't tell people the standard has changed. You enforce it by how you move. You don't announce boundaries, you live them. And that silent enforcement speaks louder than any declaration ever could. This is why reactions follow you, even when words don't. People feel the difference before they can articulate it. They adjust their tone. They second-guess their assumptions. They realize too late that the version of you they were speaking about no longer exists. While they're trying to understand the transition, you're already operating from a new baseline. That's the moment it hits them. They spoke too soon. They assumed too early. And now reality is correcting them without you having to say a single word. You're not acting out a transformation. You're not showcasing progress. You're living from a place that no longer needs to be explained. And that kind of change can't be measured, copied, or contained. It can only be felt after it's already done. Number 10. How you process everything while giving nothing away. They expected you to give yourself away the moment information touched you. A nod, a reaction, a comment, something they could measure and log. That's how most people operate. Input comes in, output leaks out immediately. It makes people feel seen, involved, understood. It also makes them easy to track. You refused that reflex, not out of secrecy, but out of discipline. You learned early that understanding doesn't need an audience, and comprehension doesn't require performance. While others rush to show they're following along, you slow everything down internally. You listen past the words. You notice timing, tone, what's emphasized, what's avoided. You catch the gaps between statements, the tension behind casual language, the intent hiding behind harmless phrasing. None of it shows on your face. That's what unsettles them. They mistake your stillness for absence, your restraint for lack. They don't realize your mind is already several layers deeper, sorting signal from noise with precision. They keep records of your pauses, assuming hesitation. They mark your silence as uncertainty. They think if you don't react, you must not understand. That assumption becomes their blind spot. Your pauses aren't empty space. They're processing chambers. You don't rush clarity to ease someone else's discomfort. You let information settle, collide, align. You allow patterns to reveal themselves instead of forcing conclusions. By the time you move, the picture is already complete. This is where their system fails. Their models depend on visible feedback, facial expressions, immediate replies, emotional tells. You give them none. While they believe they're analyzing you, you're quietly analyzing the entire environment. Every interaction feeds you context. Every word adds data. Every attempt to steer you tells you something about their intentions. They assume they're withholding information. In reality, they're handing it to you piece by piece. You don't expose what you know because exposure hands control back to the observer. The moment someone realizes how much you've understood, they adjust. They hide, they shift tactics. You don't allow that advantage. You respond only when it serves your direction, and even then, you reveal just enough to move forward without giving away the full picture. That selective response isn't manipulation, it's self-command. This is why people misjudge you. They can track what you do, but they can't trace how you arrive there. They see outcomes without understanding the process. That gap keeps them guessing. They replay conversations, searching for missed signs, wondering when you figured it out. What they don't grasp is that observation doesn't weaken you. It sharpens you. Every attempt to read you adds to your awareness while costing you nothing in return. They thought watching meant control. Instead, it reversed the roles. Their attention became your resource. Their curiosity became your leverage. By absorbing everything and revealing nothing unnecessary, you turned silence into strategy and awareness into quiet dominance. And now they're left trying to predict someone who never needed to announce what they already understood. Number 11. What really happens when you let people misunderstand you? When you allow people to misunderstand you, something unexpected happens. The pressure shifts entirely onto them. Most people can't tolerate being misread. They rush to correct the story, to clean up the narrative, to prove they are still in control of how they're seen. They confuse being understood with being safe. You don't. You stopped tying your stability to outside interpretation a long time ago. You realized that the need to be accurately perceived is often the same need that keeps people trapped. So you stepped away from it. You didn't withdraw from life. You withdrew from explanation, and that single decision changed the balance of power. When someone tries to analyze you, they assume visibility is leverage. They watch closely, waiting for clarifications, emotional cues, defensive statements, anything that confirms the storyline they've already written. They believe people can be managed if their image is pinned down. That assumption collapses in your presence. You don't rush to define yourself. You don't clean up confusion. You let silence sit where explanations are expected. And that silence doesn't make you smaller. It makes you unreachable. What they interpret as absence is actually space you control. They mistake misunderstanding for invisibility and invisibility for weakness. That's their blind spot. While they're busy debating who you are, you're free to move without resistance. You don't waste energy correcting people who aren't committed to understanding you anyway. You let them carry their assumptions while you carry momentum. That's why their attempts to read you keep failing. They're looking for confirmation, and you're offering none. They're trying to map a personality while you're operating from alignment. Being misunderstood doesn't mean you're lost. It means you're self-defined. You know your direction. You know your standards. You know what you're building. That clarity exists internally, not theatrically. You don't need to broadcast it for it to be real. The more they push for explanations, the more obvious it becomes that clarity was never about truth. It was about control, and you refuse to hand that over. This is where their fixation deepens. They expect discomfort when you're misread. They wait for you to flinch, to correct, to negotiate your image back into something manageable, but nothing happens. You stay steady. You don't adjust your path to match their interpretation. You don't chase perception. That lack of reaction unsettles them more than confrontation ever could. They try to influence you by shaping how you're seen, but perception only has power when someone depends on it. You don't. The more distorted their view becomes, the more independent you are. Their observations lose value. Their conclusions stop landing. Their frameworks start to crack. Eventually, they realize something too late. They weren't observing a persona to be managed. They were watching someone who operates beyond permission. For you, being misunderstood isn't a liability. It's protection. Number 12. The real reason their system fails, no matter how closely they watch. They keep watching because they believe proximity equals comprehension. The closer they zoom in, the more convinced they become that the answer is hiding in plain sight. A missed signal, a delayed response, a pattern they haven't logged yet. In their mind, understanding you is a technical problem, not a human one. If they just refine the lens, tighten the data, watch a little longer, they'll finally regain control. That assumption is exactly why their system keeps failing. They're operating with tools built for predictability, Frameworks designed for people who bend under pressure, who leak intent through emotion, who can be steered by reward, fear, or expectation. Their entire method depends on consistency of reaction. But you don't function inside that range. You don't respond because you're pushed. You move because something aligns. And that single difference renders every one of their models useless. They mistake your autonomy for concealment. They assume you're evasive because they can't map you. In reality, there's nothing hidden. You're not obscuring your direction. You're just not broadcasting it for analysis. They can document behavior, but they can't access motive. They can replay moments, but they can't reverse engineer intent. They can track habits, but evolution isn't a habit. It's a shift in operating level, and that's where their logic breaks. The harder they try to force you into familiar categories, the more obvious the mismatch becomes. They're trying to apply outdated rules to a game that has already moved on. Every forecast collapses. Every assumption expires early, and instead of adjusting their thinking, they double down on observation, watching longer, analyzing deeper, growing more frustrated as results refuse to cooperate. What unsettles them isn't your complexity, it's their irrelevance. Their methods were never built for someone who doesn't negotiate their center, someone who doesn't act on impulse, someone who doesn't leak direction through noise. You don't operate on their timelines or respond to their pressure points. You move when something is right, not when it's expected. That alone places you outside their reach. Their fixation grows because they sense control slipping. Not dramatically, but steadily, quietly. They feel it in the way their predictions stop landing, in the way their influence no longer produces reaction, in the way their presence no longer shapes outcomes. And every failed attempt to figure you out exposes the limits of their system more than it reveals anything about you. This is the truth they avoid. The issue was never your behavior. It was the lens they insisted on using. You didn't become unreadable to be mysterious. You became anchored, grounded, self-directed. Your clarity doesn't depend on being seen correctly. Your movement doesn't require permission, and your growth doesn't slow down for anyone who's still trying to measure it. They keep watching, hoping something will finally click. But nothing does, because the problem isn't missing data. It's obsolete thinking, and the more they observe, the clearer it becomes. You're not a puzzle to solve. You're operating on your own terms, and their system was never built to reach you. And this is where it all comes together. If this message hit something deep, it's because you're living proof that they spoke too soon, and reality is catching up. You're not alone in this shift, and your perspective matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments and say what you've been holding back. Your voice could unlock clarity for someone else. Support the movement by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it forward. If you feel called, donate a super thanks to help us keep creating powerful, life-changing content like this. Stay strong, stay aligned, and may God bless you as you continue forward with confidence and purpose.